Welcome back to the Hilton True Wealth Podcast, the show where we explore the ideas, strategies, and conversations that help people build meaningful, lasting wealth, not just financially, but in life. I'm Mark Miller, Managing Director of the Hilton Family Office, and today we have the pleasure of being joined by my partner, J. Bradley Hilton, happens to be the grandson of Conrad Hilton, famed hotelier and philanthropist. So he's following in his grandfather's footsteps, both in business and as a visionary. He's not only been my partner, but a great friend for the last 14 years. So today's conversation is going to center on the Hilton Legacy and how it inspired Jay Bradley. It's one you don't want to miss. So let's jump right in. So Brad, welcome. Glad you're here today.
No, thanks, Mark. I really appreciate it.
Well, it's a pleasure having you here. So tell me a little bit. I know your grandfather, Conrad, was about kind of changing the world through business and various other ways. Yep. So tell us a little bit about how he started in business and really how he started in life.
Okay, sure. His story is amazing. It's definitely inspirational. And, how he got his start is when he was young, he had worked for his father at their general store in San Antonio, New Mexico. And, his father wanted him to come, work the business, but he had other plans in mind and he wanted to become an entrepreneur. So he was told that if he really wanted to be successful being an entrepreneur, he needed to go to Texas. So he looked around and he found a deal that he wanted to do to buy a bank in a town called Cisco, Texas. And so he had $5,000. He borrowed $5,000 from his family and borrowed the other money from a bank. So he had $15,000 with him to go buy this bank in Texas. But then he had to get there. So from train and horseback and you name it, they ended up in Cisco, Texas late that afternoon, went to the bank and they were hoping they were going to consummate the deal, but the banker changed the deal on him at the last second and asked for $5,000 more. And, everything was a handshake deal over the wire back then. And
right.
So my grandfather was very, disrespected by it, a little upset about it, left the bank without a deal. And now it's nighttime, right? It's kind of early evening, and he and his attorney went to go find a hotel. And there's about 3 in this town, and they're all relatively small, but they go to the first one and they're sold out. They go to the second one, they're also sold out.
No room in the inn.
No room at the end. So they go to the last one and they don't have any rooms either. And so the attorney just started asking some questions like, well, why are all these hotels sold out? And they're like, well, actually, sir, we sell out 3 times a day. And, that was a little mystery. And so they asked, well, how do you do that? What happens that you can check in and out people 3 times a day? And they're like, well, these are the oil field workers. They, take an 8-hour break and they come check in, take a shower, take a nap and get back to work. But it's always sold out. And so, there's good news and bad news in that message. So, So they leave the hotel. They're walking down the street. They don't have any place else to go. My grandfather's actually embarrassed because he realizes he has to go back home without a deal in his hand, and he's just deflated,
right.
And they can't find a place to stay, and they're really tired and frustrated. So the attorney turns to him and jokingly says, "Mr. Hilton, we need a place to sleep, and you have $15,000 sewn into the lining of your jacket. We should just buy one of these hotels." And he said it kind of jokingly, and my grandfather sat there and thought about it for a second, and he's like, "Go wake up one of the owners and let's see if we can."
He thought it was a pretty good business model, I'm sure.
After he heard, the business model, but it was a pivot moment, right?
Yeah.
As an entrepreneur, his first job was to figure out, when to pivot, and that was it, right in the middle of the street. So they went back to the hotel, woke the owner up, and made the deal and bought the hotel, and they had a place to sleep that night, and the chairs at the desk at the Mobley Hilton is what it was called.
Wow.
Yeah.
So that was the quote first Hilton then.
That was the very first Hilton. It's a historical site there in Cisco. They even have billboards, on your way into town, telling this story.
Wow.
So it's really cool.
And that's an amazing story, and just the tenacity that he had. And it's like, it's like the old thing about, if you got lemons, you make lemonade, right?
Right.
Yeah. Which is the kind of person that he was, right?
Well,
Pretty much.
He was that kind of a person. And then, he had to figure out how to become a hotelier after that.
Yeah.
And it was really funny. One time he was doing the Tonight Show, or the Ed Sullivan Show, one of those. And I think it was Johnny Carson that asked him. He's like, "Mr. Hilton, if you had an opportunity to tell your guests one thing, what would it be?"
Yeah.
And his answer was, "Put the freaking shower curtain inside the tub."
Yeah, really.
Because
which that probably cost them millions of dollars.
One of the biggest problems back then was people getting water on the floor and it leaking down to all the other floors, and it just was a constant problem until they finally solved it.
Wow, that's a great story. And so how did his story and what he did in his life influence your life and your career? First of all, go back and tell us a little bit about your career, because I know you worked at Hilton Hotels starting out from a young age.
Yeah.
So kind of explain kind of your path.
Sure. So after I graduated high school, I went straight to work at our Hilton Reservations Center in Dallas. And that was a subsidiary wholly owned company by Hilton to handle all the reservations. And so I was very much into technology and computers. And so I got my start with the mainframes and running those and the communications. And it was just quite an experience back then to, go from, being a rebel teenager kind of, and moving into a career path. And, it was like a dream come true for me to be surrounded by all these monstrous computers and, being able to learn about them and, understand more about the business and how things work. So,
right. And so you worked at Hilton for how many years?
I was there for about 14 years and then consulted with Hilton after I left to become an entrepreneur for about 3 years after that. And then made a switch out of technology for a little bit. And then, ultimately got back in. So
how did what Conrad has done and your father and the rest of the family members, how did that influence your entrepreneurial career?
Well, interestingly enough, I was born, my birth certificate has the address of the Shamrock Hilton, which was kind of like the Waldorf Astoria famous hotel, but in Texas.
Right.
And so it has a story that's worth telling at some point. But my first memories are being in a hotel surrounded by lots of people and lots of activities and just being able to watch it from that point of view. And I still remember what that view is. And it's kind of interesting because everything in my mind from back then is now 3 times smaller than what it was. So I have a pretty grand vision of, just what everything should look like as far as, my perspective on how it was. But, growing up in it and then, finally joining the business, it was great, because I got to move around to different segments at Hilton and just learn different aspects of the business. And, as of late, I'm getting back into the hospitality side of things, but now on the experiential side. So,
right. So, for the listeners out there, I mean, what was it like being growing up and even today having a name like Hilton? And being in that family and how people react to you and just, just curious about that.
Yeah. It was kind of interesting growing up. I didn't even know I was a Hilton until somebody told me. I think it was in junior high school. Somebody caught on to it and was making a big deal about it. And I just couldn't really relate to it in any kind of big way. Right. Yeah. I knew we were Hiltons. I knew we were in the hotel business. I just didn't, realize the stature,
how important it was.
To other people. And so, around then people started making a big deal about it, but I just, basically stayed grounded and just stayed who I was. I just consider myself a Texan and, just kind of grounded. And so, it never really got to my head. And, we grew up, or my father started out separately, through a divorce, lived with his mom. And so he didn't grow up in the exact same lifestyle in his later days as his brothers did, which I think helped lend itself to keeping us more grounded and
Sure.
just
That's
like
what I've always
regular folks.
appreciated about you is that you're a very grounded guy and easy to talk to and easy to kind of, connect to when I see you with other people. And I think that it sounds like a direct result of kind of your father and your
I
family life.
I
And,
think so.
yeah.
Even still to this day, it's still hard to relate to that. The name is such a big deal, but I remain grounded. It does open up a lot of doors,
Mhm.
but it also closes some things for you, especially when you're growing up with that name.
Right.
People make a big deal about it, but once you start going into the working sector and have a boss, they have different opinions, and so
Right. Right.
they feel challenged or something about it that it can either help you or make you stagnant. And so
Right.
I got to experience both sides of that. I had to really prove myself that I was there for a reason, not just a pretty face per se.
Right.
And I was able to really accelerate what I was doing. I mean, my mission in life wasn't to be the Hilton and this, that, and the other. I'm a technology guy, so I wanted to do technology and just leave me alone and let me do that.
Right.
And I did some pretty extraordinary things for Hilton. I'm always on the advanced cutting edge side of technology and was able to find something for Hilton to use that allowed me to replace some programs and initiatives that they had that were, even though they were automated, they were very manual and just very labor intensive and painful.
Mm.
And we would lose people left and right every year because we have to go through this seasonal process of what they call solicitation management.
Right.
And so, the entire industry has to go through it during the season. And it's just the biggest nightmare you ever saw. It's all contracts going to, hundreds or thousands of hotels, and they all have to be, looked at, verified, those kind of things. And so back then I looked at it and said, well, there's no reason anybody should touch a piece of paper or do anything. It should just be magical and just a push of a button and it's done. I couldn't find anything in this whole process that wouldn't allow for that. So what was interesting, we found out later, was IBM and Accenture had been working on this for Hilton for several years, right? Using their product lines and like 50 developers. And I had found this magical tool that allowed me to, well, it was an application development tool, a rapid application development tool, and it allowed me to do things in days or weeks versus months or years. And after I got proficient in that, I was able to complete the project in about a 3-month period of time, end to end. And I think we completed about 120% of the project, meaning we had time left at the end to add some extra features that really closed the loop on not just doing all the contract, but getting it fed into the system and the system being able to organize around it. And so yeah, we got it down to, after the first year of people doing this, after that, you just look at the screens, change a few numbers, hit the button, and that entire contracting cycle in those 3 or 4 months that it took so many people to do, now it's just done by a single person at the hotel, and they just push the button and the magic happens.
So ultimately, they realized that you weren't just the Hilton name, but you could add a tremendous amount of value to the corporation. Obviously,
then it always came to, what have you done for me lately?
Yeah.
So,
Now you had some real pressure on you.
It was just kind of interesting growing up in that. And so, I was actually glad because, after Hilton sold, or I'm sorry, not sold, but we purchased Promise Corporation at a point in time where we were at about 550 hotels, and that purchase took us up to 2,500 hotels pretty much overnight. And so we had to compare our systems with, the existing systems that were there. And I knew I was on the right track because I had no validation what we did was the greatest thing since sliced bread or anything. I just knew we had done a good job. I just didn't really put the significance on it or the ROI value to it at this point in time. But Promise Corporation had been working with IBM and stuff on the exact same problem. They'd spent years doing it, and we're real happy with their progress and where they were. And we let them go first in our synergy discussion. And so after seeing what they had, I was kind of smiling on the inside, going, "Oh my gosh, we completed the mission. They probably have 20% of what we have after, 2 years and 3 months. We were done." And so it was really, kind of kicked off a light bulb in my head that, this particular tool and what I can do with it, why am I just working for a regular paycheck? And so I just got the itch to go off and
talk
be
a little bit about
self-made and
you moved
become
on.
an entrepreneur.
Right.
So I had to make the decision to leave Hilton and make that announcement and leave without any ties to Hilton either. And, fortunately I was able to get, as our first gig, a consulting gig doing exactly what I was doing before, but being paid a whole lot more. So, so it finally, got to that fulfilling stage of, the efforts that I'd put in.
And ever since then, you've been
then
an entrepreneur.
9/11 happened, right at the end of us deploying the last thing. That happened, which was my entire business model. Becoming an entrepreneur was serving airlines, casinos, and hotels. And 9/11 killed that business plan while I was watching TV. I knew that it was going to cripple the
When you saw those
airline.
planes hit, you were like,
Yeah.
"Ugh."
Yeah, I had a feeling. I knew planes weren't going to be flying much anymore. People weren't going to be wanting to get on planes. Thoughts were going through my head, and it turned out to be that way. And it was an interesting pivot moment for me there. I was like, oh, great, what are we going to do now? And so I had a partner that I was working with, and we started looking for other opportunities, but more local to us. And he lived in Phoenix, and so we did some bidding on some government contracts that were using the same kind of technology Hilton was using. And we won that contract, and we were able to apply these skills and these time-saving factors and these ROIs to Phoenix's criminal justice system. And they liked what we had done through this first contract so much. We worked for them for the next 10 years, automating all of Arizona. So we did the cities, the state level, and the county levels, and then we blended or integrated all those systems together, all the way from the time somebody gets booked all the way to the time they're released, and their case history is all a part of our system, and we manage all the bookings for prosecutors to go to court and public defenders. And so the system just magically coordinates all those things. It never gets the name wrong, which was a big problem in the past. So I was real proud to have done what we did over that period of time. And it was just kind of a unique experience, kind of forced by 9/11, that got me into that mode. So it got me out of hospitality for a while. And so I don't know, it was just an interesting time. And
so then that launched you into start doing a lot of different entrepreneurial things.
I got tired of doing technology at some point. It was just consuming too much of my life.
Although that's still your passion.
It really
technology,
is. But I needed to think beyond, more than what I can do with existing technology today. So that's when I really started looking out into what the future might look like, right? So I'd say about that point in time is when I started becoming a visionary, and that just set in over time to where I would say now I'm, looking 50 to 100 years out. I can make an impact and change people's lives so they don't have to be dependent on government, and to where everybody can pursue, that life happiness.
Yeah. And I think what's so cool about that too is that the legacy of your family and even of your grandfather and various other people in your family in a way is carried on, because when I talk to Brad a lot, he talks about changing the world, and that's something that your grandfather wanted to do through all his
it is, and this
philanthropic
endeavors. Is probably the thing biggest for me. I didn't know till later after I figured out he was a Hilton. That was a big deal, things of that nature. And he was king of the entrepreneurs, with that pivot that he'd made and the success of Hilton. But something really interesting happened. So he was already successful with Hilton here in the U.S. Americans weren't really doing business outside of the U.S. because nobody knew how that worked, and there wasn't a lot of access to it. But the government came along and asked my grandfather if he could build a hotel in a particular country. And the first question was, well, how do you do that? And they're like, well, we don't know but we want to do it, and so we'll help you
Mm-hmm.
figure it out. So he was, coined as one of the first international businessmen. So he went out, he built that hotel, but while he was out doing that and going international, he looked around and saw the condition of the rest of the world outside of the United States, and it was not a pretty picture, right? War, he detested war. He looked at war as a disease, a brain disease, a mental illness. Yeah. And I can't disagree with that. So my grandfather committed $11 million for the Mayo Clinic's very first grant to study why men go to war. He looked at it as a mental illness and wanted to see if there was a cure. And so he gave them the $11 million, but as far as he was concerned, they misappropriated the funds and decided to study cancer instead. So at the time, he was upset about it, but the ultimate result is, the Mayo Clinic is what it is. So, yes. So that was fantastic.
So your grandfather, obviously, iconic figure, his son, and then Baron, who ran Hilton Hotels for quite a period of time. Yeah, tell me where you fit into the family, rather than me explaining it. But tell everybody where you fit
considering
into the
my grandfather's first generation, and then his sons were second. I'm third generation, and so we had Baron, Eric, and Nikki were the brothers, and Baron, was the oldest and took the seat, for running Hilton. He had actually become an entrepreneur early in his life and started the Carte Blanche credit card, started an orange juice company. At the time they failed, but later he took Carte Blanche and made it what's now Hilton Honors. So he got to take those seats. My dad, had to start, because he lived with his mother after she divorced Conrad, and they lived in El Paso. So my dad was kind of, he wasn't in the Bel Air, Beverly Hills bubble anymore. He was in Texas and kind of living a more ordinary life. And he wanted to be a baseball player. And so the interesting thing is he'd gotten a contract to play for the AAA team for the White Sox. And he brought his contract home, told his mom how excited he was about it, that he had a contract, and she ripped it up in front of him. Said, "No, you're getting into the hotel business." So he did, and he had to start sweeping the basements at the El Paso Hilton, and taking care of the boilers. So he ended up working his way up to the highest place he could go within Hilton. So he was the vice chairman and head of the development side of things. So he never had the place to make it all the way to the CEO. But his crown jewel of things was he helped start the Conrad brand, the international brand. Why we did that was because
Conrad Hotels,
right, because we had sold off Hilton International,
right? And that was in what year? That was
I think that was in the 70s. I think we sold it to TWA at the time.
Oh, wow.
And so Hilton Domestic was one thing, and then all the international were that. Everybody considered it was one brand under one hood, but in essence it was two separate companies. We did make a deal with them later that tied us closer together, so we didn't lose that. People didn't think of Hilton as two separate things. But we wanted to start, Hilton Corporate wanted to be in the international business at one point. So my dad came up with the concept of the Conrad Hotels. And so we did that, and I think he got 10 of them built, which are fantastic hotels. And then we got sued by Hilton International for competing against them in the international market. And so at that point, we made a deal with them and ultimately ended up buying them out and reclaimed it. And so now the Conrad brand goes on. So.
Right. And in 2000, was it 2008, where the whole brand sold to Blackstone? Correct?
That's right.
Because a lot of people still, when they do business with us and everything, still think, hey, we're running the hotels.
Right.
But it's Blackstone, not BlackRock. People get mixed up between. Blackstone's also a big private equity firm too.
That's right.
And was sold. And so the other question I get a lot is, well, tell me about Paris. It's for the older generation.
Yeah.
We've talked about the older generation. They all know Conrad and just the legacy there. But tell me about Paris. And some people kind of have a negative just because of when she was a teenager. They kind of know that when she was really out there in the public a lot. But tell me a little bit for our listeners, kind of who she really is. And I think there's some misnomers about her.
Sure. It's kind of interesting. I was never really close with her, but her father, Rick, I knew. But my memories of Paris back in the day, when she was up and coming, was she had a magazine spread in Vogue magazine, I believe it was. And, it was very, what do you want to say? Risque. Especially because she was so young.
Right.
But she was modeling in, like on the bed in my, uncle's bedroom. So my dad sees this for the first time. Somebody's showing it to him at the house, and, he flips his lid thinking, oh my gosh, this is going to be so bad for Hilton.
Yeah.
This is going to drive the stock price down, things of that nature. So those are the things that were on his mind about it. So he called his brother Baron and said, Baron, what the hell is going on? This is terrible news. And Baron just kind of chuckled and laughed. He's like, what are you talking about? He's like, this spread, it's in your house. How did you let her do this? He's like, well, what's wrong? What's your problem with it?
Yeah.
He's like, well, this is going to hurt the stock price and everything like that. He's like, no, brother, this is how it works. All good is good. All news is good news.
Yes,
it's keeping the
all
name.
Publicity
it's keeping the name relevant and out
absolutely.
there. Now, we don't want it to be catastrophic bad news or anything, but news like this, will be looked at in several different ways. But it keeps that Hilton name, in the circle, and so that was his response. And my dad, he wasn't very much of a marketing guy, but really had to think about it a lot to consume that and take the role of watching and seeing what happened. And so my uncle was right. But, it kind of gives you an impression about, who Paris is. But, I would say, she is, a believer in God. She, loves singing in her choir, not necessarily as being a DJ and things of that nature. So a lot of people wouldn't see that about her, right? But, she was more of a business person, wanted to create a brand.
But respected in the family.
Respected in the family, sure.
Yeah.
She created reality TV.
That's right.
For something that, seemed so goofy at the time
Paris
in its own
and Nikki.
way.
I remember that.
Yeah.
The Paris and Nikki show.
And that's right. Yeah. So, she was just having fun with it and had a lot of great success there. And that kind of set her on her own path with her own brand. And from there, she grew that into her own clothing line. And Nikki had her own purse line. And, they still run those things today. But, they run those companies, right? Which, that isn't an easy thing to do because it's actually a very big global company now. And then, like Paris has, they both do work with the Hilton Foundation. We all do in the fourth generation, or a lot of us do. Mm-hmm. And so I get to see her from time to time there, and Nikki. And, they're just great people. Everything will be perception that you would see on TV and make an opinion about, but they're very into the causes that, the foundation supports, and then they have their own interest. And I find Paris's interest right now very interesting from something that happened to her when she was young that she did the documentary on, which was, she got abducted out of her own home to be put into a school for out of control teenagers, basically, of wealth. And that didn't go so well. These schools were very abusive. The parents didn't know these things. I happened to have some inside knowledge about it. So I was really proud of what she had done. And now I'm really proud she's taken on all these schools that do this and looking to put them out of business. And nobody else had stepped up to do that. I mean, it is a big problem that's been around for decades and decades. It's kind of this hidden thorn in the side of so many that they didn't get to express themselves. But because she has a name, she was able to come tell her story, which was directly relevant to it, and a good reason why either these schools need to be more regulated or just put out of business altogether.
Right. So that's great. Great point. So you mentioned the Hilton Foundation.
Yeah.
which is goes to something that I think a lot of people don't know. They just assume that every Hilton has gotten $1 billion. So share that story a little bit about how Barron was and how your grandfather was,
Sure.
and what the foundation has done.
You know, in my family, it's kind of interesting. Apparently, we don't believe in inheritance. So my grandfather started that trend, and again, he was a philanthropic type. So he wanted to leave all his money to help people. So he left, I think it was like 97% of his wealth for the Hilton Foundation to form it. And well, he had already formed it, but to give it enough money to complete the mission, which was his last will, right? So when he passed away, he left instructions as to what he wanted it to do. So he left a majority of his wealth there, and just left a really tiny bit to everybody. And then the same held true with both my dad and with Barron. You know, they both did the same thing. They both put their money into the foundation. So now it's one of the bigger foundations in the world.
It's like, isn't it a few billion a year that's given away? Or
well, not a few billion. It's in the hundreds of millions. I mean, it has
which
billions,
is still a lot of money.
But
yes,
in order for it to sustain, you know, it has this giant wealth, and it makes investments so that we can keep raising that amount year after year, and contributing the maximum that we can to stay afloat.
And that is just amazing stuff. It really is. And so the last question I would ask you is just the legacy. How has it influenced your entrepreneurial career overall?
Thanks for that question. You know, it's been great. You know, just I'd say over the last decade, my interest in changing humanity for the better, and also in pursuit of world peace like my grandfather is. I loved his concept of world peace through international trade and travel, but the same things are still happening in the world today that they were back then. He even actually wrote a prayer poem that he read on the Ed Sullivan show to America, called America on Its Knees. So if you get a chance, look that up. It's a very powerful prayer. But it basically talks about war and, how we can end it, through prayer.
Yes.
And so it's a very moving piece. So everything he did was very inspirational from that perspective. My contribution to that is to add technology, education, and entrepreneurship to that mix.
Yes.
I call it world peace through prosperity.
Mm-hmm.
And, the 5 pillars of that include, what I just mentioned. And I think that combination of things and the push that I'm doing for advanced technologies and advanced materials, the things that can, change humanity from that perspective, followed by, having people come together to, have a place of peace and that they can work out their difference. Because once you start trading with people and you have business deals, the last thing you want to do is kill them. And so he realized this. And so if everybody was involved with trading with each other, nobody's going to want to kill each other. And that's the idea.
Which there's some of that in the world today, but there's not enough of it.
Yeah,
so
we still have the same enemies. We still live in
this fallen world, and where there's a lot of evil people doing a lot of evil things and causing a lot of chaos. And but what I love about that too, and we're carrying that on with the Hilton family office.
Yes.
And that whole concept of making the world a better place through prosperity.
Absolutely. And in future podcasts that we do together, we'll get more into the kind of things I'm working on in advanced materials and things like that, and the way I see that those things will change the world and make things more available to people at cheaper prices that are 10 times better than what we have today. If we can do that, so everybody has access to things, everybody has mobility, everybody has a shot to find or pursue happiness and health and wellness, all those aspects of life, I want to contribute to it in a very positive way. And so another topic that we'll discuss is that I'm heavily into is the health and wellness side of it. It's too much suffering with all the things for both the individual going through something and families.
Yes.
And everybody has to go through it. And most of it is not necessary, to have everybody go through this, these heart-wrenching moments when they could be avoided if everybody was given the right opportunities to take care of themselves in the right way. So
Totally
anyway,
agree.
we'll talk about those in future.
Absolutely. And we will have future times definitely with Brad. So that brings us to the end of today's episode of Hilton True Wealth. A huge thank you for Jay Bradley being here and just sharing his expertise, his wisdom, and perspective on the Hilton Legacy. So if you enjoyed this conversation today, be sure to follow us wherever you get your podcasts so you never miss an episode. And if you found value to what we've talked about today, share it with someone who might benefit too. So for more insights, resources, and to really, if you'd like to, get a free copy of our book, Hilton Wealth, How to Invest Like an American Dynasty, visit us at hiltonwealth.com. Thanks for joining us. And until next time, keep learning, keep growing, and keep building your true wealth.